the Storyville Vice District is quite interesting and filled with ironies. The specific history of Storyville is from 1897 to 1917. Storyville is actually the city's last and smallest vice district, but because of its concentration, it's actually the most notorious. New Orleans had vice districts as early as 1857, and through the last half of the 19th century, they're shrinking through every subsequent ordinance. There's a reform victory in 1896, and those reforming politicians who come in, among other things, want to reform the city's reputation for vice. One of those local aldermen, Sidney Story, makes a proposal to shrink the boundaries of the vice district once again and force all prostitutes and other vice establishments, particularly gambling, into the boundaries of this Storyville Vice District. Today, the piece of land that Storyville sits on is inhabited by the Iberville Housing Project. It was just behind the boundaries of the French Quarter, just a couple of blocks from Canal Street. So even though its intent was to keep vice less visible within the city, it's quite convenient for anyone who wishes to visit the district. And particularly during the winter racing season, which took place from the end of October until about April, people would come from all over the country to watch horse racing, bet on horse racing, and many of the people who came to do that also patronized Storyville. During the winter racing season, particularly in Storyville's high years, within its first decade, you might have as many as 3,000 prostitutes working in Storyville at any given time. The district exists all year long, but like even now, in our tourist season, the summer is the doldrum season. That was true in Storyville as well. But it is a going concern. There's an enormous amount of money being made in Storyville, a lot of graft being paid to local police, and interestingly, the most profitable thing in Storyville is not sex and prostitution, but alcohol sales, which are the highest level of profit within the Vice District. That Vice District is not effectively opposed by local reformers. Local reformers' numbers are small. They try on occasion to make the Vice District less visible or shut it down. They don't have very much effect at all because there are so many people who are benefiting from the vice and graft of Storyville. There's a man named Tom Anderson who served as a state legislator, who was also called the mayor of Storyville, who had an enormous amount of political influence both within and without the district. So there were political people who protected that district and profited from it. Ultimately, it will be the federal government who is responsible for shutting Storyville down, and it happens in the run-up to American involvement in World War I. And part of that involvement is that local cities begin to vie to be ports of embarkation and debarkation for the troops who will ultimately go to Europe. And so New Orleans, being a port city, wanted to make sure that it had its piece of that pie. The federal government, which is conservative and reform-oriented during that period of time, has people within both the Army and the Navy who pass laws that say you can't have an Army base or camp within 5 miles of any vice district. And New Orleans and its politicians try to squirm and try to keep Storyville open in a variety of ways. The mayor of the city actually visits the Secretary of the Army and the Navy to try to keep Storyville open. But ultimately, the Department of the Navy prevails, and toward the end of 1917, the city is forced to shut Storyville down. The mayor of New Orleans at the time, Martin Berman, is credited with saying about Storyville and prostitution that you can make prostitution illegal in Louisiana, but you can't make it unpopular. And Storyville was a spatial piece of evidence for that particular point of view.